Today's episode, if you are missing out, is sponsored by Fiverr. You may know Fiverr as the preferred source for freelance services, but did you know that they also provide online courses as well? Learn from Fiverr is an online, on-demand video classes platform specially tailored for freelancers and professionals. All classes are taught by top experts who are distinguished in their fields. These courses contain practical and comprehensive knowledge. By taking the course, you'll level up your skills and grow professionally. And by successfully passing the course's final quiz, you'll showcase your new capabilities. And the best part? Pay only for courses you want to take, with no monthly fees. Visit our show notes for more information to see if there's a Learn from Fiverr course for you. Every course you enroll in using our link goes directly to making this show better. Thank you for your support.
And now, on with the show.
Ladies and gentlemen, the story you are about to hear is true. Only the names have been changed to protect the innocent. Fellas, I want to know what's your favorite fictional story with fictional characters that's based on real events. Tom, you go first.
Okay, so mine, I don't necessarily want to say it's my favorite of these, but it's one I did watch within the last year or so that really found a place in my heart. I was going through all of the movies of David Gordon Green's I hadn't seen before because I know I'm the freak that loves his Halloween trilogy, and I know I'm right. People are the world is gonna come around on this just like they did with Rob Zombie's Halloween 2. And I just wanted to see the stuff that I hadn't seen. And he made a movie. It's either his second or third movie, third or fourth, I should say, called Undertow, about two young brothers who have to run away from their uncle because their uncle kills their father looking for gold coins that their father got from their grandfather. And it's just so filled with that rich sense of place and character that David Gordon Green is so masterful at, that I love so much. And it feels like you're watching real life at play, even though it's not filmed like a documentary or anything. It is a very gorgeous movie in its rural aesthetic. I think it's a very underseen, undervalued movie, especially within the more respected era of David Gordon Green's career. And I love that movie a lot, and I highly suggest people check out Undertow.
All right, Mike, you're up.
I mean, my answer is going to be very trite. I had a backup prepared if Tom picked the one that I'm talking about, just so we wouldn't be talking about the same movie. I could have talked about Inside Llewyn Davis, which is based on David Ronk's life loosely. But to me, there's only one answer, which is that, the greatest fictionalized version of a true story, and we talked about it in our first season. It's Citizen Kane. Right?
Yeah.
Now, obviously, like as we've talked about, it's not entirely based on William Randolph Hearst. It's a conglomeration of people, but it does decide, and I guess Boogie Nights falls into the category too with its retelling of the John Holmes story that also acknowledges John Holmes exists. I think that what Citizen Kane does so well is understanding that by divorcing itself from a real person, by giving it a fictional name, it can play in real events when it wants to, and it can also completely fabricate things that it wants to because it's better for the story. And I think there are so many movies indebted to Citizen Kane for playing in the based on real events sandbox while giving them the freedom to still make art and not be bound to just the fact. So for me, it's Citizen Kane. Every year since 1989, the Library of Congress has selected 25 films to add to the National Film Registry. The criteria? The films must be culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant.
Each week on You're Missing Out, we take a look at one of these films to try and get to the heart of why they were selected and why they still matter.
This week, returning from Season 1, Carrie McCabe is back for 1951's A Place in the Sun.
Our guest today is the co-host of Ain't It Scary with Sean and Carrie. Joining us again on the show, this time solo, Carrie McCabe is here. Carrie, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
For such a very, very lighthearted movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a romp.
I'm so excited to have you on for this, and I will admit I told you this in a message, but this is one we started this show back in 2020 in an entirely different world. And you and Sean were on season 1 talking Vertigo, but all the way back then when I was plotting out this show, I knew that we had this coming up in the 3rd season, and if we made it to a 3rd season, you were the person I wanted on for it. So we are cashing in on a 2+ year plan. So I'm very excited to do this.
Yeah, I feel like not many people have a lot of interest in both true crime and Elizabeth Taylor specifically, so it fit pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, because we should note for anybody who is unfamiliar, Ain't It Scary is a show where you talk about conspiracy theories and the supernatural and true crime, and you also focus on, I would say, the greatest mythological figure in history.
Mhm.
You did an episode of your show recently, or at least recently as we were recording this, that I believe was done specifically for me and me alone, devoted to Jeff the Talking Mongoose, my
Absolutely.
my favorite mythological figure. So I was very happy to hear that. If folks haven't heard that one, check it. I mean, they should check out other episodes of your show too, but most of them, as far as I know, do not contain you having to do the voice of a talking mongoose.
That was a choice on my part, and I think I did pretty well with it. I think I really brought Jeff, them to life, whatever Jeff is.
Well, I'll have you note, the audience is not going to see this, but I am wearing a shirt that does say "It's Jeff." It's about a different Jeff. It's from Marvel Comics, but I thought,
Well, thank you
paying
for
it
that lovely tribute.
paying it forward. In addition, that you do talk about true crime. You talk about things. Sometimes your show has to dip into sad territory, and you guys always cover it with a bit of joy and exuberance and a passion for the topics. You never slip into the kind of melancholy that I don't know we did a couple weeks ago, talking about this year's slate of registry picks, which were all sad.
Well,
So many sad.
Yeah.
so much sad, so much just existential weight punching Mike right in his fucking
Mhm.
chest. Getting to tears.
And
I was bummed, but Mike was crying.
yeah, I cried. I cried multiple times. No, the funniest one though is when Kyle's reading the titles and he goes, "The next one, Titicut Follies," and you hear both Tom and I just let out a sigh.
Oh.
You're on to talk about today a movie based on a book, based on a real life crime and tragedy. And, in the real life crime and tragedy, it's the tragic story of a young girl seduced by her boss who drowns her in a lake. And in the book, it's the story of tragic circumstances of a capitalist system that puts a young woman, vulnerable woman, in this situation and puts a young man in a headspace where he decides he has to commit murder to advance socially. And in the movie, it's the tragic story of Montgomery Clift being saddled with this mouthy broad when he wants Liz Taylor. So
Okay. Okay. All right, you open the door here. Okay. She needed to die. Like, right? Okay, like we're gonna
get into this. So we're talking for everyone listening, we're talking about A Place in the Sun. And I did that setup before we talk registry, before we talk anything, to give everybody a little sense here, which is each one of us is coming at this from a different point of view. Tom has seen A Place in the Sun, and the other thing is, as he talked about last season on Red River, he is a fan of Montgomery Clift.
big fan, yeah.
I have read the Theodore Dreiser book, An American Tragedy, that the film is based on. I am just all in on Shelley Winters, especially late era Shelley Winters when she is half-assing it through Debbie Reynolds' exercise videos. We'll get into it. And Carrie, as you've noted, the part of the reason that you're here, in addition to us just telling you to come back on, is twofold. And I don't know if you'd like to tell some folks a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, in terms of my love of Elizabeth Taylor specifically, um, I really became interested in her and her work around the time that she passed away, because that's also when I read the book Furious Love, which had recently come out. I think it was 2010 when it came out. And I was just getting more into biographies, and I kind of just wanted to read about this really famous love story in Hollywood. I love reading old Hollywood kind of books. And something about this story and also her life really just captured my fascination. Just one of those people that you just instantly want to know so much more about. I had never really seen her films. I saw her in the Flintstones, I think, as a kid, but I wasn't super familiar with her aside from the fact that she was like a screen icon. And once I learned more about her, I found that there was a lot to relate to. She went through a lot of shit in her life. She had a lot of medical problems all throughout her life that, I could kind of relate to, going to the doctors all the time and still trying to push through it, and also her advocacy for um, gay people, especially during the AIDS crisis, I found really admirable because it was something that no one was really doing, especially not someone so in the limelight like her, and someone from old Hollywood really coming out and saying these people need help. So, I found that really fascinating, found her life and her person very fascinating. And then I kind of went back and watched these classics that she was in, Giant and Cleopatra, and of course, A Place in the Sun. And I developed a real fascination and also kind of like a love for her because I think, unlike many people back in old Hollywood, she was never apologetic about who she was. She was always very authentic, and it could get her into trouble with the press and everything. But she was always very upfront about being an imperfect person, even though she looked like perfection. She was one of the most beautiful people to ever exist. But she was always very honest that she was imperfect. She could be selfish. She could make bad choices in terms of her roles, in terms of her life. And she just always kind of owned that, and I really admired that about her. So I first saw A Place in the Sun during this time when I was doing a lot of research about her.
And to the other point, I mentioned like Tom's coming at it just having seen the film. I've read the book. You've also ahead of this done a lot of research into the actual crime that this original story is based on, right?
Yeah. I actually got into true crime and also my interest in, the real story of old Hollywood and these stars, including Elizabeth Taylor, around the same time. I was always a very much a narrative fiction girl growing up. And around the same time that I got into true crime, I got more into reading biographies and all that. So it's very intertwined for me. And I've known about the case as long as I've known about the film. It was famous for its time, but it's kind of one of those forgotten cases now, unless you read about it in context of like upstate New York or um, cases that have inspired films, things like that.
Without further ado, I am going to read what the National Film Registry had to say about A Place in the Sun. Here's what the Library of Congress had to say. Loosely based on the 1925 novel and subsequent stage play An American Tragedy by Theodore Dreiser, the film tells the story of a working-class young man, Montgomery Clift, who becomes involved with two women, one who works in his wealthy uncle's factory, Shelley Winters, and the other a beautiful socialite, Elizabeth Taylor, and the eventually tragic consequences. Directed by George Stevens from a screenplay by Harry Brown and Michael Wilson, it was a critical and commercial success, winning 6 Academy Awards. Modern audiences have not been as impressed with the production, aside from the performances of the lead actors, finding it slow-paced and lacking in depth or social relevance. The fuck, Registry?
Does it always like slip in shade to
No!
these?
And I don't... So I want to be clear, I don't read these before we get on air.
Mhm.
I probably should. But yeah, like very rarely do they get digs in, I think. I remember reading
Yeah.
one for, I want to say My Man Godfrey, where it takes a dig where at the end where it's like, and of course, watch this instead of the musical version with David Niven. But this, like, the fuck, man? What was that?
Also
Also,
very
no
strange.
social relevance.
Yeah.
What the fuck are they talking about? This got inducted 3 years after Reagan left office. This is prime era of let's shit talk the rich and how they ruin everything. You fucking mopes.
So that is a fascinating thing.
What the
Uh,
fuck?
that is a fascinating thing about A Place in the Sun and American Tragedy, because actually, I should note, I will own this. I did not see A Place in the Sun until this year. Well, I guess last year. We're in 2023 now, but 2022. That's because I knew it was a classic. It was on the AFI lists, all of that. But I had always told myself I'm going to wait until I read the novel. Right? I'm going to wait until I read the novel. It's like 800 fucking pages, and I've had that paperback for decades. To give a hint of how long I have been working through that book, I had brought that with me to work one day when I was an intern at Trauma Entertainment. So it has been a decade since I started trying to make my way through Theodore Dreiser's and American Tragedy. Because of this podcast, I did finally finish the book and watch the film. But it is fascinating. In fact, funny enough, when I was at Trauma, I remember Lloyd Kaufman came in one day and walked by my desk and saw I had the book out, and he goes, there's a movie on that, that Joseph von Sternberg did of that in back in the 30s, which I had no idea, and I was just like, oh, really? I only know about Place in the Sun. He goes, yeah, no, von Sternberg did one in the 30s, and I went, oh, I'll have to check it out. And he goes, don't, it's awful, and left. By the way, ahead of this podcast, I watched it. It's bad. It's a bad version, which is what makes this one all the more interesting, I think, because apparently, like, George Stevens had to fight really hard to even do this.
Yeah.
The studio was because the 30s version was such a flop, they really didn't want this to get made again because it was a notorious bomb. So they really didn't want it remade. They insisted on the title being changed, all of that. I mean, for context, like, that's the equivalent of if Rian Johnson decided, he announced like his follow-up to Glass Onion as he went to Fox, and he went, so I want to remake Monkey Bone. Like, that's like truly the equivalent of like people going, what? No.
The exact same thing. Yeah. Monkey Bone and the Joseph von Sternberg version of this story. The equivalent. Yes, exactly.
It's,
you gotta name drop Monkey Bone in there.
You know what? Not a terrible film. I rewatched it recently.
Oh, shut the fuck up.
But anyway, it's fascinating because, and we're gonna get into this more. But watching the von Sternberg one, my problem with A Place in the Sun, I shouldn't say a problem. I'm not going to start out negative, but I do come from the place of having read the book, which is an 800-page book. That book is the most sprawling indictment of America that perhaps anyone has ever written. It's a criticism of capitalism. It's a criticism of industry. It's a criticism of the justice system. It's a criticism of our political system. There's whole subplots about the reason that Clyde is getting prosecuted is because the mayor is up for re-election and he really wants an execution to bolster his numbers. And the last chapter is about a priest losing his faith in God because of the case. It's like there's so much going on. And any adaptation kind of has to get selective about what they're choosing to focus on. The von Sternberg one, much to Dreiser's frustration, rips any capitalist criticism out of it and just makes it that Clyde, or whatever the character, in this one, that the Montgomery Clift character in the 30s version is just sex crazed. It's, because this girl gave it up, he lost his mind and had to murder her. It's bad. It's real bad.
Well, that's related.
But I'm curious. So, Carrie, you mentioned you watched this as part of your Elizabeth Taylor research. Tom, what was your relationship to A Place in the Sun? Had you seen it before? Were you familiar with it before, or was it just for this show you checked it out?
My history with this movie was I saw that it was coming up for this season, and I bought it, and I watched it last year, and I watched it yesterday to refresh my memory. and I thought it was great a year ago. I think it's great now. It's a weird movie, though. There's some shit we could talk about that is some interesting choices. Mainly, Shelley Winters. She needed to go. It's a weird choice to make her that much of a fucking unrelenting asshole.
I agree. I think that, and I wanted to bring that up because, like, all of us grew up with movies, right? All of us love movies. We do what we do, and we got into the fields that we did because we grew up saturated by movies. And yet, to the registry's point, when they talk about, you know, how the movie's legacy, none of us had seen it until recently, despite being on the AFI list and everything. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that, and we can talk about it more later, but George Stevens refused to let this air on television.
Yes.
Really?
Yeah. He made sure that if there were any commercials, he would have to, like, when it was eventually aired, he would have to have approval on any commercials that would interrupt the film.
He didn't get that approval, though, because what happened was it aired once on NBC, and a judge was watching, and the judge was supposed to make the determination, did any of the advertisements they aired during the movie detract from the movie's overall theme and messages? Stevens' argument is any advertisements would, because this movie is literally about the destructive nature of capitalism. But the judge ruled none of them did because the movie was too engrossing to possibly be detracted from by commercials. So in a beautiful way, Theodore Dreiser's ultimate message that our justice system is inherently flawed and run by buffoons bore out in this case. Because what the hell is that judgment?
I mean, hell, that's a pretty baller move from Stevens.
Yeah.
I love that. Wish more people had the balls. No, you are not running Jurassic World Dominion with commercials. I say no.
Tom, I gotta be honest. If Colin Trevorrow had just come back from the things George Stevens had just come back from overseas, he probably would have the balls to do that. Anyway.
You want to make a third Jurassic Park movie about dinos taking over the world, but it's really about locusts? You unrelenting... How hard did the mule kick him when he was young?
Carrie, in case you get worried that this is going to get in trouble, my advice is to watch the Kyle camera. Anytime you see him look down for a second, that's him making a note of a time code. That's him just going, all right, and there's that. That's got to go.
Out. He's getting stressed already, I think.
So we mentioned George Stevens and the war. I mean, that's obviously a thing that hangs over this film in a big way.
Oh yeah. I mean, even if George, I think Montgomery's close name is, right?
Yeah.
It's George.
In the movie, yeah.
I think even though George isn't a veteran or anything, he has this. You get this sense that this is about like what's happened to the young men of America, and that while he may not have come from the war, he's someone that's not sure of his place in things. He's timid. He's charming, but he's timid. He feels like he's always like looking over his shoulder, like he's been beaten like his entire life, and the vicious way he latches onto, and it's not even vicious. It's not like he's fucking Jordan Belfort or anything, but it's like the fact that he's even willing to contemplate killing a pregnant woman to keep his position rising up in a business just feels like something that, like, you know, veterans came home and some of them became gangsters because they didn't know what else to do. Some of them came home and, you know, they had families and they, you know, beat the shit out of them. And like, it just has that sense of the young men in this country, something happened to them, even if it's not an exact one-to-one narrative story that he's telling.
And I think that, you know, I mean, and I'm going to be coming with, you know, 800 pages of backstory that's not in the movie, but there is also something where the role of George in the book Clyde, in the role of his religious background is so important because he comes, you know, they allude to it in the movie of just, oh, his mother's out preaching and all of that. That's a heavy part of the first chunk of the book. The entire first American Tragedy is divided into 3 books. The entire first book of the American Tragedy is essentially just exposition dumped by the rich uncle in the first scene of the movie, right? He's just, well, he's
Yeah.
coming to me because he was in Kansas City and and da-da-da-da. That is like 300 pages of book, and one of the things about it is, and I don't think you need it in this film, because one of the things about it in the book, the book is written in the 20s, is in 1926. It's set in the 20s, and one of the things that happens is Clyde, later George, grows up in this religious upbringing. His mother imparts on him, like, God is everything, God has a plan for everything, all of this. And then he gets a job working at a hotel. I think he becomes a soda jerk, something like that. Starts partying with these younger, slightly richer people. They go out on a crazy drive one night, and they hit and kill a kid. And he escapes. He runs away and never gets caught for it. And you kind of feel this moment of, he just witnessed this horrific tragedy, and there's no consequences, and there's clearly no God's plan. And that sort of warps him entirely into like going fully capitalistic, fully nihilistic, fully there's no God. What I think is interesting is that this incident is removed from the movie, I think, because you're meant to think, well, he was an able-bodied young man during the war. He went to the war. So our explanation for why Montgomery Clift rejects that religious upbringing is the shit he saw overseas. Like many who came back and went, no God would allow this, and came back. And I just think that that's an interesting specter that looms over this character. And the book harps on it hard, but,
Well, it fits too, because the book was 6 years after World War I, and this is 6 years after World War II. So it's dealing with a similar thing of the young men in this country have gone through some shit, and at least with World War I, it was literally like there was no reason for this. In World War II, it was like, okay, there was a justification for what we did here, but there's still, they saw true evil. And like I said, I don't even think you need to have the war as a part of Montgomery Clift's backstory. I think just you could just simplify it to, he grew up poor and he hated it, and he got a little taste of it, and he realized his uncle was rich and that he could not live this miserable peasant's life helping other people. And, because I think that's more of an indictment of America. I mean, we see it now. How many people, will storm the Capitol because they think if they're nice enough to rich people, they'll become rich one day. It's so many of these people don't even actually go through anything traumatic. They're just born with a chip on their shoulder because they didn't have everything handed to them. And I don't know. I think it's interesting as, like, either way you look at it, the character just works. You know what I mean?
I mean, I think that there's something to, again, as I was saying up top, if you're adapting this 800-page sprawling indictment, you kind of have to pick and choose what you're going to do. Now, there are a lot of departures from the book in the film, and I would imagine, Carrie, you can speak to how much it departs even more so from the original crime that this is based on. But, one of the things that I find so interesting watching it again is thinking about, okay, well, how much of this was changed to update it for modern times? How much of this was changed to differentiate itself from the catastrophic bomb that was the 1930s one, right? I guess a better analogy than Monkey Bone, which is would be it is a little bit like A Place in the Sun is Denis Villeneuve's Dune to David Lynch's 80s Dune. Like, 80s Dune was such a bomb, and everybody went, you can't film it. It just means you can't film it. And then Villeneuve makes half of Dune and wins a bunch of Oscars, and it's a huge hit. And the entire time he's making his Dune, he's got to be thinking, all right, how do I separate this from the failure Lynch Dune? Like, I guess we don't have a pug in this movie. Decisions like
we
that.
add Jason Momoa,
and take out the pug. But I say that to the idea that, it differs. And one of the things that I found the most interesting is, and we're dancing around it, we're touching on it, the book, I mean, obviously, I'm saying this to set you up, Carrie, to talk about the crime. So, I'm putting you on deck here for this one. But the book is extraordinarily sympathetic to the Shelley Winters character, whose name is Roberta in the book. We get a lot from her perspective, and we get a lot of her just reconciling with the Clift character, Clyde, in the book. We basically see Clyde work his way up, and he gets into his uncle's factory. And he gets to his uncle's factory, and he gets a management position in the factory. And he starts to think, this is it. I've made it. I've made it here. I found my place in the world. And he meets Roberta, and they're not supposed to fraternize, but they like each other a lot. And they start fooling around. And there really is a connection there. And there really is you know what? That's going to be the girl I settle down with in this position, the position that I'm in for the rest of my life. And then he meets the young pretty girl from the rich family, the Elizabeth Taylor character in the film, who is insufferable in the book, by the way. Interminable in the book. She's like a little girl. She's of age, but she has no concept of the world. That moment where she talks to him and says, like, in the movie, when Elizabeth Taylor says her thing about, oh, mama, come here to mama, or whatever, right? In the book, that's all she does. She only baby talks to him and calls him Clydey Whitey, come to mama, and shit like that. But the book is very much about the idea of kind of, oh, man, this guy thought he had it. He thought he had it settled. He thought he had it squared away. This was his life. And now a better opportunity presents itself. He has another opportunity to advance, but in order to advance, he has to destroy everything he was before. Now, I say all that. First, I want, Carrie, your perspective on the actual crime itself, what we know about these real people, because obviously this crime happens, Dreiser decides to interpret it, and then I want, after you talk about that, Carrie, I think we can all just kind of talk about like how interesting what Stevens does to adapt it to the 50s is. But if you could just give us a little background on the crime itself.
I just want to lead Carrie in with a question about the true crime. In the real crime, did the guy who killed the girl decide to take a walk around a 1 mile radius of the crime scene, running into every single person in the county so he could place himself at the scene of the crime? Or was that something that they came up with for the movie?
Tom, it's in the book.
He was arrested soon after, so he wasn't super sly about hiding after the crime. So I'm sure it's not like, oh, and here's the Boy Scout. Oh, and here's the other guy. But he was arrested like a day later, or like right after the body was found. So he wasn't that sneaky about it.
But give us a little background on the whole story, Carrie, if you would. Give us
I do want to hear a little bit
synopsize. I know you're going to probably cover this more on your program, so
sure.
I don't want to take too much material away from you. And by the way, to folks listening here, I want to plant a flag real quick. I want to call my shot. All right? You're going to do your episode, right? I'm going to Karnak style put something in an envelope now. At some point, when you bring up them going to somewhere upstate New York and the real guy drowning the girl, at some point during that, your husband is going to go, and then he changed his name to Ted Kennedy and he ran for office. At some point, he's going to do that.
Said when we were watching, he was like, "This is very Chappaquiddick to me."
Guys, do not, Carrie.
His mind.
Carrie, don't tell him I said this, and I want you to just hang on to this moment and on the episode say I called that shot months out that he would do that bit. I want you to just have it on the record that I did that. I called it. Thank you. Now tell us about the crime.
Sure. So this is about the murder of Grace Brown, and I think the most interesting thing about the real life crime is that unless there's something we don't know, and this happened in the early 1900s, there's no love triangle in that story. There's no third part. There's the guy and there's his pregnant girlfriend. So already, I mean, you don't have that romance aspect. And when you're looking at it with Montgomery Clift and Elizabeth Taylor, it's like, oh, they're so beautiful. They have such chemistry. They should be together. Or at least that's kind of one of the feelings you get. Whereas in the true crime, in this murder, there was no sort of tragic romance angle, which makes him immediately less sympathetic, if you can sympathize with him. But um, this is based on this murder, and it was committed possibly by a man named Chester Gillette, young man, probably around the same age as Montgomery Clift was supposed to be in the film. And he's in real life, this Chester Gillette was the nephew of a skirt factory owner, and he didn't grow up well off. So this uncle of his gives him a job, and he starts to work his way up. And he meets Grace Brown, who is another girl that grew up poor, and they start a relationship. They eventually consummate that relationship, and she does become pregnant in the spring of 1906. And I mean, for anyone who watches the movie, they dance around a lot when it comes to the pregnancy, and it is so scandalous. And the fact that the movie even shows a lot of it, even for the 50s, it was very taboo, and they had to be very careful. So in the early 1900s, it's even more taboo. It's even more of like this horrible secret. And there's no other factor that goes into his decision making, but it does seem like in the real crime, he just either didn't want to be with her, didn't want to settle down with her, because that's kind of what you would do back in the day. You would marry the girl that you knocked up, and kind of fudge the birth date of the kid, and hopefully, it all looks on the up and up. So either he didn't want to commit to her, or he was moving up, and the thought of saddling himself with her or committing to her in that way, who, she's also a worker at the factory, that doesn't look good. It's one of those reasons that he decides to do what he does. And we don't really know the true story um, of what happened, but basically, Grace became pregnant. Gillette promises to marry her, and they end up going to the Adirondacks for kind of like a romantic time away. And some people think that she may have been moved to a maternity home, or at least that was the plan after they married. So, she's hopefully going to go away. They're going to get married. She'll have the baby somewhere else, and there won't be a scandal. And he decides to take her to this place called Big Moose Lake, and they go rowing out on the boat. Somehow she falls out of the boat and she drowns, and he survives. So it's a very similar story in that sense. It is believed, or at least it was argued by the prosecution, that she was hit over the head, maybe with a tennis racket, and that knocked her off of the boat and she drowned. He, or the defense, argued that he had nothing to do with it. He was just sitting in the boat, and she became confused and jumped into the water, clothes on, and drowned. And he didn't know what to do, so he ran away. So obviously that doesn't really sound like a very good cover story. It's like she just jumped in, like, what's she doing? She thinks you're gonna marry her. Well, she thinks you're gonna marry her. Why would she kill herself if that was what she was doing? And so he did. He was arrested very soon after the body was found, and he was part of this very sensational trial. It's pretty closely represented in the film. And he was found guilty for premeditated murder, sentenced to death. The appeal failed. The governor refused to grant clemency, which is the same as in the film, and he was electrocuted to death in the chair in March of 1908. And so that's the real ending. That's the real story, as much as we know about it. And there are certain aspects of the crime where he checked into their hotel with like a pseudonym. So he had a monogram on his suitcase that had his initials. So he used a pseudonym, Carl Graham, so it would match his suitcase, but they wouldn't know his real name. So that kind of points to premeditation for me. Like, why are you going under a pseudonym? Maybe it could be a thing of, oh, well, I don't want to be known for being with this pregnant woman, and it's taboo that we're sharing a room and we're not married. But it seems pretty suspicious to me. And the story, there's no good explanation that the defense offers. Her just jumping into the water also doesn't seem realistic to me. So it seems pretty likely that he did kill her, and whatever reason he had for that, whether that was a society thing or just he didn't love her, didn't care about her, not sure. But that was kind of the main crime story.
So the initial thing makes it into the book as well. And in fact, that's part of in Dreiser's telling, like there is a bit of a moment, not to spoil a recent film, and I won't give too much away, but there is a bit of a moment where the investigators pull a Benoit Blanc at the end of Glass Onion, just going, "This is so dumb. You gave them an alias, but you kept your initials the same. CG, you kept it. You gave them two other names, both of which also have CG." But in the book, the way the crime is played out, I think is so interesting because you mentioned in the real story, the defense didn't have a good argument. In the book, the way it works is Clyde is thinking about killing her. He takes her out on the water. He has a camera wrapped around his neck, a newfangled camera, which he's been using to take pictures of her on the trip. They're on the boat, and he has a change of heart. Because the other difference between the book and the movie, besides Roberta being much more sympathetic, is that by the end of their correspondence, when she's finally like, "You have to marry me," she goes, "I don't care about you. You have to marry me to make me a respectable person. And then if after 2 years you want to just call it quits, we can move different places, we can do different things, but you have to marry me now." So by the time they get on that boat in the book, she's very transactional, and he has a change of heart, and he starts to see, like, as opposed to the film, which makes the big grand romance out of Taylor and Clift, in the book, by the time he's on the boat with Roberta, it's like the guy who's been carrying on an affair having a nice moment with his wife again, and it's like, what am I do? Why am I throwing away my marriage over like this 20-year-old? But there's an altercation on the boat. She gets hit in the face with his camera. It goes swinging. She gets hit in the face. She falls in, and she can't swim, and he chooses not to save her. And what's interesting about that is that the book goes on to say the prosecutors find the camera, and she has lacerations on her face. The book is graphic, describing how beat up she is. They find the camera, and the investigators go, "My hunch is the camera hit her, but we can't prove it." So they take strands of her hair off of her corpse and stick them in the camera to plant evidence that he struck her intentionally. Meanwhile, he tells his defense attorneys the actual truth. "I took her out on the water. I planned to, but then I didn't go through with it, and it was an accident." And they say, "No one will believe that. So we're going to create a different story, and you have to tell that instead." And he obviously gets convicted and gets electrocuted, but it's essentially like it boils down to him in the end telling his priest, "But this is what really I did not actually kill her. Like, I didn't actually kill her." And the priest goes, "But my son," like in the movie, he goes, "But my son, it was murder in your heart."
Yeah.
And it's that construct there. But with all of that in mind, we're talking about, Carrie, you're talking about a case from 1908 that captivated the country. Dreiser writes this book in the Roaring '20s and makes this, exploration of capitalism and sex and all of these things, including, Clyde learns about sex while he's in Kansas City with all of these, loose women and party gals who seemingly have readier access to abortions, things like that. So he seems to not even understand that that's a consequence, until everybody. So all of that leading up to George Stevens chooses to adapt this book to the 1950s. He updates it. He sets it in what is then modern times. So I guess what I want to get into is the many shifts that this takes and the transmutations it takes from that original crime, as you just described it, Carrie, with no love triangle and just girl gets pregnant and he drowns her. How does that become a movie that in many people's eyes is considered a tragic romance today. What is it about? What are the decisions Stevens made to get us there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few major decisions, one of them being that in the film, the crime itself is depicted very similarly to the book, um, in that, if anything, it's more of a manslaughter. She does fall in, that's accidental, but he kind of seems to choose not to save her. And that was his choice, right? So there's that. We're showing him in a more sympathetic light, just in the fact that we don't see Montgomery Clift knock this girl over the head and her fall in. Like, the crime is changed from what it likely was. And there's also the fact that there's this love triangle. And I think for the film, the book is a different creature because it's got so much to it. But for the film, to have this rumination on American capitalism and the, the fragile facade of the American dream, they really symbolized all of that in the character of Angela, in Elizabeth Taylor. And that's why George Stevens cast her. He hadn't even seen her work in anything, but he'd seen her because, of course, he had. And he said, like, she's the only one that could play this part because she represents that girl on the candy box, as he called it, the girl in the Cadillac, the beautiful girl that every American boy thinks at some point that they could marry. And that it's that aspiring to something more that she represents. And I think to make him at all sympathetic, to make it an American tragedy through his eyes, it's obviously a tragedy for the girl that died, but that's not our lead character. That's not what our perspective is. It's his. So, especially in the 50s, you got to kind of like him a little bit, or at least empathize with him or sympathize with him. And so we have this love story because, we are all taught that love is the grandest thing in the world. And it's so tragic that he would have to not have this love because of, choices he made, obviously. But, it's only a tragedy if there is some reason behind it. And so, first of all, we have to kind of sympathize with his character, and we have to kind of root for him in a way just to make watching the film tolerable, or else it's just an awful story about a guy who kills a pregnant woman. Um, so I think, she's there. Elizabeth Taylor's character is there to symbolize everything that he is striving for, but also to have this romantic angle to make him at all likable to the audience, which he would have to be if you're just adapting this small chunk of it. Or else it's just a guy that kills a girl, and that's terrible, and that's a terrible thing to do. Um, so, that's kind of modified by the film, I think, very intentionally.
I think in the movie they shouldn't have shown the boat. The boat scene shouldn't have been in the movie.
You wanted
I
more
don't
I
ambiguity.
think it would have. I think it would have been a lot more interesting for us to have to be, for the first time, not in his shoes. For us to, they go on the boat and they go off, and then we see him come out of the boat, come out of the lake, and kind of have to wrangle with, all right, we spent like an hour and a half with this guy, and we've seen how he really never cared about this girl. How she really was just, he was just out chasing some poon. That's literally, he just wanted to get his rocks off, and I'm not trying to, like, honestly, I'm not trying to be gross, but that's literally just like, it literally just, he found the weakest link at the factory, the one he knew he could get in her pants, and he'd keep her around until he could find something better, and then he did, but he got locked down with this pregnancy. And we see how important it is for him to rise up in the ranks, how much he does actually love Elizabeth Taylor's character, which I think is a smart decision, because if it is just, well, he loves her because she's rich and it's a bullshit relationship, it's kind of just, there's no ambiguity really there. It's like, yeah, he's a climber, but he does love this girl. So you got, okay, fuck, he's an asshole, but he does actually love Elizabeth Taylor. He's stuck with this girl, but he's got to do the right thing, blah, blah, blah. I think if we have that whole end of the movie not knowing, and we have to think, all right, we've spent time with this guy. Is he telling us the truth? And because, like the priest says at the end, either way, he wanted to kill her. Whether he did it or not on purpose or on accident, like, I don't think we need that scene.
The reason I like the scene is because, to me, the stealth MVP of this movie is Shelley Winters, because she did not she wanted the part because she was familiar with the book, and then apparently, and the anecdote goes that she came to these because she was a sex symbol back in the day, which is maybe hard to think of if your understanding of Shelley Winters is like playing Ma Barker in that Roger Corman movie where she's like chomping a cigar and shooting a machine gun. But she was a sex symbol back in her day, and if you read her Wikipedia, it cites all of the many affairs she had with everyone from like Sean Connery to William Holden. Then again, Elizabeth Taylor, as Carrie and I were discussing off mic, had an affair with Colin Farrell. So whatever. They both got their body counts. We're not, we're not shaming one over the other. They both were champs. But my point is, Shelley Winters was considered a beauty in her day. She dressed herself down, made herself look like shit, went to see George Stevens and went, do I get the part? To just kind of show, like, I could do this. But apparently her and Stevens fought a lot because she wanted to make her character more sympathetic. Because in the book, the character is very sympathetic. The character is this girl that was taken advantage of. And the thing that I love about Shelley Winters, especially in that boat scene, there's moments where she finds a way to give this character such humanity, even though the movie as a whole, because it is from George's perspective, George Eastman, Clyde Griffiths in the book, it's from his perspective, and it's trying to make you feel what he's feeling. The movie is desperate for you to hate her. And then there's that moment when she's sitting there and she goes, I'll tell you what I wish. I wish that you still loved me. Or I wish that you loved me again. And you just feel this thing of, even setting aside everything else, before a death even happens, you realize that Clyde or George has already done something very cruel by just making this woman feel loved and cared for and abandoning her the minute there's an opportunity to social climb. Especially because one thing I think is interesting about Stevens' choices here, in the Dreiser novel, it's a much longer period that they're together. Their courtship goes quite a bit longer. And Clyde genuinely seems to have affection for her. So much so that even when he's stuck with she's pregnant and all this stuff, he's still trying to decide, which woman do I want to be with? Interestingly, the first time they go back to the apartment, and he starts to kiss her, Clift is already playing George predatory.
Yep.
He is already doing moves, right?
Mhm.
There's no emotion or passion there. He's just doing, like, going step by step of, okay, well, if I start to kiss her here, and then if I start to kiss her next, she'll be more open to me doing, like, you watch him plotting it out. And you do kind of realize, I think, there's two moments in this movie where Winters is, I mean, that moment on the boat, I wish you still loved me, and that moment when she's sitting in the doctor's office, and she just says, well, somebody's got to help me. There is something about the, while I do, we were making fun of how unrelentingly awful the movie makes her character and how insufferable, there is something about watching the film, especially second or third time, by the time she gets on that boat, it's not just that George has abandoned her. It's that this entire system has failed her. That while George is basically getting every opportunity to rise up, because a scene that I love, the book, obviously the first chapters of the book, very mocking those Horatio Alger novels of, like, if you just shine enough shoes, you'll get enough nickels to buy your own shoe shine box and that kind of thing. In this, the uncle comes over to George and goes, you shouldn't be working in this department. You should be higher up with us. And he goes, oh, did you see my efficiency reports I sent in? And the uncle's clearly like, what the fuck you do? We don't do that here. I don't care what reports you wrote. You're in my family. Come to this party. George gets so many opportunities to rise up. He stumbles into success just because he was related to it. Meanwhile, systematically, that same system has failed Shelley Winters again and again. She got taken advantage of by her boss. The doctors won't help her. Like, it's this is even a little thing that couldn't have been planned when they go to the courthouse, right? They go to the courthouse and it's closed. They can't get married.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, did either of you catch, I only noticed it the last time I watched it, the name of the town they go to?
No.
So in the book,
Must
it's, I'm forgetting the name of the town in the book, but it's just a name. But George Stevens, being George Stevens, very pointedly, the place where they go to try and get married, and the court where it takes place, and presumably the lake where the murder happens, because that's where the case takes place, is Warsaw.
Oh yeah. I remember them saying that. It's such a specific reference. Um, I mean, you have to think Poland,
I'm
especially in 51. And so it's very deliberate that he chose that.
not just especially in 51. I mean, let's not forget what George Stevens, if anybody watches Five Came Back on Netflix or just knows George Stevens' history, George Stevens was the one who filmed the camps.
Yeah.
He was there filming. So I think that's a very pointed thing. I think both because, obviously the name evokes so much, and I think he is trying to say in a way, like, he's trying to evoke the idea that, that our system, so many systems exist and create opportunities for people to think they can justify murder. Another great moment in that courthouse, by the way, that again, I only caught the last time I watched it, was after they step away from the door, right? They step away from the door because the courthouse is closed, and George is telling her, look, we're going to go out on the lake. We're going to have a good time. Behind him, and they linger on it after they leave, is the very same courtroom where he will later be sentenced to death. So it's that moment right there when they step away from the door, in the courthouse, that it's just like, well, this is predetermined. It's all coming back here.
So Stevens does a few things that I think really are meant to steer us in more in one direction than another. One is obviously really focusing on that love triangle, making that part of the love triangle Elizabeth Taylor. Because as you said, Shelley Winters was a sex symbol of the time. She's very pretty. She's obviously frumped up for the movie, but she's no Elizabeth Taylor. And that's kind of like every scene has that bit of, well, she's nice, but she's no Elizabeth Taylor, Um, or she's nice, she's no Angela Vickers.
Yeah.
So we kind of are going into it like that, of like, yeah, I mean, she seems like a nice girl, but Elizabeth Taylor. And then, George the character is constantly seeing Angela Vickers right before or right after he has a scene with Alice. Usually like before, and it kind of makes Alice very obviously a consolation prize. And I think we're supposed to see her that way. And that's why she is particularly pitiful, I would say. That there are insufferable aspects
Jeez.
about her. To be sure, she's always got
Very
a teary face. She kind of seems whiny. Um, stepping back from it, it's like, what a freaking terrible situation for this girl to be in. But she's just kind of pitiful in the movie for a lot of the times, aside from, Mike, the ones that you mentioned. And I think we are supposed to feel that way because George Stevens obviously has some sort of empathy for the character of George Eastman. And that's probably why he did show the boat scene and made the choice to make it pretty definitively an accident with negligence of not trying to save her. But I think he does that because he has that empathy for the character and he's trying to instill that in us. He's not saying what he's doing is right, but he's probably saying what he did was possibly justifiable because of love and trying to strive for the American dream,
I think the most pitiful thing that Shelley Winters does in the movie, or the most just like the stupidest, Montgomery Clift is so clearly just thinking about murdering the shit out of her on the entire boat ride. It looks like it's written on his forehead, you're going to die tonight. And she just keeps blathering on and on as if this was a guy who ever actually did care about her. The only time he ever cared about her is when he finished inside of her. That's it. But I think I don't necessarily disagree with what you're saying, Carrie, that he has sympathy for George. But I think what he's doing is a little more interesting, because we are making fun of this Shelley Winters character and making her more of a wet rag, and making Elizabeth Taylor's character a lot more of a human being, someone you'd actually want to be with.
And less
I think what he's doing is
manipulative than the book too, as well. Like, she's obviously more
Yeah.
likable from what Mike you've said. She's more
Yeah.
likable in the film than the book as a character.
Yeah. So, like, I think what's interesting is that he's really heightening the ambiguity, which is one of the things I love about the movie, is the ambiguity of everything, which is why I wish the boat scene wasn't in the movie, because I love the ambiguity it plays with. I like that the ambiguity of the movie is, okay, Shelley Winters is annoying and she sucks, but George did do this to her. He is responsible for what he did to her. A man should, whatever you want to say, like, a man, whatever. I don't care. It's fucking 1950s. But a man is supposed to take responsibility for his actions. He did this to her. He knocked her up. They try to get an abortion. They can't. So, okay, what are you going to do? You have to take responsibility for this. But then you have the rich side of it, where Angela is, she's a bit of a condescending asshole in the beginning. She's like that rich ditzy girl who doesn't really understand the world or whatever, but you do get to see she's a good girl. But you see the world around her. Everyone thinks George is a fucking idiot. He's just a yokel, that he's just some guy riding his uncle's coattails, that this is a fake, phony fucking world he's trying to get into. So it's this very complicated thing of, like, you get why he wants to be in this world, but also we're seeing that he shouldn't. We get why he doesn't want to be with this girl, but we know why he has to do the right thing. And, I think based on what you're telling us about the true story and what Mike has told us about the book, I think these changes were actually pretty smart, to be honest.
Oh, I think certainly for adapting it, you kind of have to make a choice on how you're presenting it. And if you're going to focus on the perspective of the George Eastman character, you have to go one way or the other. He's either a complicated hero or a complicated villain, and I think they go more of the hero route with the choices they make, but that's because they do it through his eyes.
I think that one of the things, I mean, again, in the one big change is in the book. Once the Angela Vickers character, once the crime happens, she's gone. Like, she's sent off to some boarding school. She's never heard from again. They don't bring her name up in the trial to protect her social status, but he never hears from her again. And obviously
until death row, and he's
No.
about to get killed. Oh, in
No.
the book.
In the
sorry.
book, he never
Okay,
hears
yeah.
from her again. And I think that that's in part because the book seems to be coming from this idea of George or Clyde in the book, you wanted to get up out of poverty and you wanted to get away from your mom's religiosity and all of that. So you reached out to the family connection you had, and you were able to find a decent life. You were a floor manager, right? The system, you worked your way up the system, right? But the thing is, the movie touches on this too, but there is this idea that you can work your way up, right? But the people who are already there, the Angela Vickers of the world, they can get away with things. If they're attached to a crime, they can walk away from it.
And we see that with the cop pulling her over.
Exactly.
Oh, I love that guy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very white privilege. It's like not everyone would have that reaction to being pulled over.
And it's wealth privilege, because George, here's the thing, George, you were able to get away with it. You were able to rise above your social class. You were able to get to the factory. But guess what, buddy? Then you got to play by the rules. No fraternizing with the staff is the rules. But what George does is he looks at somebody else and goes, why can't I have what they have? And whether it's in the book or the film, but especially the book taps into this idea of Clyde says all he wants to do is rise above his station, right? And he's, and he does it. He gets there. He gets to the factory. But once he gets to the factory and he gets it, it's not enough. It calls to mind. We've evoked Mad Men on this show before, and I swear there are so many other works of art about American capitalism. But I just go about this idea that one of the things they did so wisely on Mad Men was to get into this American idea of whenever Don has stability in a relationship, he starts to cheat because he wants the spontaneity. And whenever he has the spontaneity, he wants the stability. And one of the things in the book, the girl, I think it's Sandra is her name in the book, the Elizabeth Taylor character. As a a man in my 30s, I look at that and I listen to her I read her baby talk and I see all this and I'm like, dude, what are you doing? You have a nice girl back home. You got good enough. Just you be good enough. But he can't, and it's like those guys who throw away their marriage because the 20-year-old girl says she loves him. You're like, dude, what are you doing here? Stevens, in adapting it, yes, he makes Elizabeth Taylor more sympathetic, but I do love the fact that he casts Elizabeth Taylor because Elizabeth Taylor has the kind of look where if you went, well, this guy threw away his entire marriage to hook up with her, you go, yeah, okay, I get it.
Fair enough.
He shouldn't have done it. Like, he shouldn't have done it, but I get why he did it. And that's kind of a difficulty with any kind of adaptation like this. When you are a novel can tell you a story of, let's call it forbidden romance. And because it can put you in the character's head, it can help you understand why this person is interested in this thing that from the outside we would go, what are you doing? Don't do that. Right? I mean, obviously Nabokov's Lolita is kind of the classic example everybody goes to of the reason that can't work as a movie is in a book, all you have to do is go, this weird creep finds that person sexy. But when you make a movie, you're in the tough spot where you're like, well, I guess the audience has to understand why this person is attractive. And so
But
you end
most
up
people,
doing
hopefully, are not going to sympathize with that
but
thought in
but
Lolita.
that's the whole that's the whole difficulty of it is it's like you either have to cast somebody, a straight up, child, and then the audience can't understand what's going on in this guy's head that he would be drawn to that, or you cast, a fucking, basically 19-year-old, 20-year-old, and you go pretend you're 12, and it doesn't work. With this film, the one thing it does pull off really well, for me, I think Stevens leans very hard into the romance between George and Angela, but I do think by casting Elizabeth Taylor and letting her kind of flutter in and out of a scene carefree, you do understand why somebody would go, if I just have her, my life will be complete. And it won't be. He'll never be happy. No one's ever happy. That's the whole point. But I do think that casting her is such a master stroke because you instantly get it. The minute she walks in, I mean, the playful way when he's on the phone with his mother and she goes, "It's me, Mama." Yeah, hell yeah. Great. Good, and obviously you can dig into that and, see the way that he's replacing his old mother with Taylor as his new mother and all of that. Part of the reason you're on Gary is obviously your affection for and fondness for Elizabeth Taylor. This is one of those cases where she in this movie, I think she gives a good performance, but she is also a special effect. Every time she comes on screen,
She's a symbol. She's a symbol.
Yeah, she's not a character.
No, and they had to change the title from An American Tragedy, not just to distance it from the original film, which was terrible, but because all of the House Un-American Activities stuff was happening, and you couldn't have an overtly anti-capitalist film be okay in Hollywood at that time. So first they had to change the title because An American Tragedy was too negative. Then you have to create this character that is a symbol for what you can't explicitly say. And, changing it to A Place in the Sun is very interesting because I think that's exactly what happens here is he is an Icarus. He flies too close to the sun. He wants more and more and more. He wants to go higher and higher. And that's his downfall. The American tragedy here is not the murder. It's his tragedy. It's his tragedy of wanting too much from the American dream. And she is the American dream. And it's so
And
attainable.
he does literally
and it's right
burn
out
to
his
death at the end.
Pretty much.
I think that's super interesting. I'm so glad you said that, Carrie, because I think that's super interesting that that's your read on the term "a place in the sun."
And I think it's mirrored in the cinematography. There's so much light and shadow, so much shadow in the scenes with
Mhm.
Alice. I mean, when she first begs him to marry her, they're in a pitch black car. You barely see her face. You don't see him as well. That's not very normal for how to light a scene.
Mhm.
When they're, first making out a little bit in her room, it's full shadow.
Mhm.
When she first is confessing things to him, we're kind of like in the shadows, in the corner. Her back's turned the whole time. It feels very eavesdroppy, and she's symbolizing this kind of this dark side of him, this dark side of the American dream. Whereas Angela, she's always bright and bubbly. She's wearing this beautiful white dress. She symbolizes light and sun, and she is the glowing American dream. And he keeps on getting dragged down into the depths of darkness by his choices and the things that he can't escape, his upbringing, his trauma, wherever that comes from in his background, whether he was in the war or whether it was just growing up poor or family issues. He obviously has mommy issues. He keeps on getting pulled back by that, and he keeps trying to rise above it. And the real tragedy for him, at least as I see George Stevens showing it, is that he tries too much. He tries to rise above his station too far. A little bit maybe, okay, we're okay with that. But you try to get the girl and the job and the life, and it's too much. He's Icarus. He falls, he dies. And she's the place in the sun to me.
To like latch on to what you're saying, I think it's also that it's that he's saying that he's trying to do all these things, and he has that based on the system you have to do bad things to become to get to this place, but that he's trying to play the innocent, that he's not this bad guy who did this bad thing, who has this bad shit in his heart. He's trying to be, no, I'm a good guy, I'm just trying to have a good life. And it's like, no, my man, you knocked this poor girl up, you led her into a situation where you know full well she can't swim. Literally tells you the first time she talks to you she never learned how to swim. So even if you had your change of heart, you literally brought it to the one place she cannot survive, and you're trying to play this meek little innocent, oh, I'm just a good little boy who's trying to get some money. No. I honestly think it's a little more cynical. I think it's the movie's kind of saying if he just went full bore into like being a piece of shit, he probably would have got away with it. But because he was just trying to play both sides of the fence, is that he got caught. He got caught. That's I don't know. I kind of think that's it. I'm loving this movie more. Movie's dark as shit.
Well, it is,
It is
but
Hell yeah, I'm
dark.
painting this on the side of a van.
Tom, you can't be that close to the microphone if you're going to yell about your enthusiasm for murder in film. Like it just blew out the more excited you got.
Fuck you.
Anyway, Kyle's like researching new filters now. Anyway, no, but I think the reason I say that, Carrie, is because you mentioned that. I think that's so interesting when you say a place in the sun and you think of Icarus, because a place in the sun. To me, when I hear that title, I think of it in a more biblical sense, and I think of the idea of a place in the sun representing like the idea of stepping out of the shadows, stepping out of darkness, and being kind of graced by these rays, graced by having your moment in the spotlight. And I think because George comes from a religious upbringing, right? He has ingrained in him the idea of God and being chosen by God. Because I think one of the things that is very difficult, and they talk about it in the book too, growing up with these evangelicals and all that, one of the things that can be very distressing, I think, if you grow up in a religious upbringing, especially a Christian upbringing, and you buy into that early on, is as you read through the Bible, you start to be like, I feel, you look at the early stories of Moses and all these people, and you're like, man, God showed up like every day and was just having personal one-on-ones with you and would be like, I got this, buddy. I got, here's what you got to do. Here's what you don't got to do. And I think that obviously that doesn't happen anymore. So if you do believe that happened once upon a time, like you now go, weird, he's not interjecting anymore. And you're looking for some force to guide you on the decisions that the answers were not in the book for, right? If like a la Book of Mormon, you're looking for somebody to talk about your specific circumstances. And I think that with George, he thinks what he's looking for is that moment where he can step out into the light, where he can be seen, where he can be somebody, right? Where he can matter, because it's deeply intimidating to think that you don't matter, right? The same reason
Absolutely.
any of us just like fall into a panic when we think about how big the universe is. Like, he's having that. And I think, you mentioned the way that Stevens lights the scenes. It's also the way he shoots them. The camera is very fluid when he is with Angela, and more specifically, he uses very tight close-ups on Clift and Angela so we can see their faces and we can connect to them. And then after the party, when he goes back to Shelley Winters, the camera is static in one shot in the apartment, in the shadows. There's so much of that. The use of close-ups is exceptional in this film. One of the best uses maybe in any movie of close-up. But I think that what it's really about in that way, when it's talking about A Place in the Sun, is this idea of George wanting to matter, right? And wanting to be somebody. But also, sunlight is the best disinfectant. So if you're going to do shady things in the shadows, it's going to be found out because you're so desperate to be seen. He can't help. He's so desperate to be noticed that it's almost comical that he gives the boatman a very, he should have given the boatman a name like John Smith, and instead he gives an insanely specific name, right? And as you noted, he runs into the Boy Scout troop. He runs into all these. It's almost Coen Brothers-esque how often he keeps fucking up, and that's because he is so desperate to be seen and accepted. And even the fact that we start the movie with him hitchhiking, and then he spots this gorgeous tweed suit in the window, the kind of tweed suit that in 1946 or 47, if somebody was wearing, you'd go, that's a sharp go-getter. And of course, he shows up in the tweed suit to the family's house. They're all in tuxedos, and he looks shabby. But he's so desperate.
It also doesn't fit him very well.
No, it doesn't. He's so desperate.
And this is Edith Head doing the costumes. That is a choice to make it look a little old-fashioned on him, and also just fit loosely. It doesn't fit, just like what he's trying to do, where he's trying to fit in. He doesn't fit in. And it starts with the suit, and it just gets worse, obviously.
Speaking of Edith Head, let's just take a moment. We're just going to have a moment to acknowledge that white dress that she designs for Elizabeth Taylor is one of the finest dresses in film history, right? We can all just acknowledge that.
Yeah,
it's perfect.
Absolutely. And
Pretty good.
It became the most popular prom dress of that year and the year after. Girls would wear rip-offs of that prom dress because they were just they wanted to be her. They wanted to look like that. And even watching it over again last night with my husband, like, I don't think he'd ever seen an Elizabeth Taylor film. Obviously, he'd seen her. And then she came out in the dress. He goes, wow. Just like he had seen like a special effect,
Yeah.
because that dress is amazing, and she's amazing in it. And again, it's this whole symbol of just like, wow, I could be with that. I could have that. That's amazing.
And it's, I think that to that point, there is something about, even in the moment, one of my favorite scenes in the film, maybe my favorite scene in the film, is in the book. There's all of this writing about, George in the book, Clyde, his mindset as he determines that he reads about in the newspaper this couple where the girl drowned and the man is missing, and all they found were their hats floating and all of this. And we get his whole mental process of contemplating murder. And Stevens, I was very curious, after I finished the book, of, well, how do you visualize that? And the absolute brilliance that Stevens does of having the radio playing those warnings, right?
Mm-hmm.
About all the safety things. The drowning is just one of them. And while George is listening to that, you have a neon sign outside the window flashing Vickers, Vickers, Vickers. And you just, it's all Clift on his face, showing you what he's thinking. And I love that so much because there is something about, the book is written in the 20s. The crime was in the 1900s. In the 50s, some of those elements of the plot, like a rowboat, aren't going to land quite as, don't make as much sense. I love the idea that rather than it being like in the book, oh, I read in the paper about this couple that died because it's the 1920s. We're always writing about couples that die, right? I do love that in the movie, the choice is to make it one of those hokey 50s radio broadcasts that's, and stay safe out there, everybody. You have a grand old time at the beach. Make sure that today, when you keep the fun out and keep death away and like all of that, it just makes it all feel so much darker in a way. Like the fact that we juxtapose that with Elizabeth Taylor and her friends out on a speedboat. And what does George have? He has a crappy little rowboat. It's just there. I don't know. The juxtaposition of 50s glamour and 50s modernity while still keeping elements of a 1920s story. I think it makes a great juxtaposition, especially in that murder plotting scene and the way Stevens executes it.
Great movie, and I just feel like I can't finish the episode without praising my boy Monty. I really like. This is another one of those movies where it really solidifies that he is my favorite of that era of method actor guys who like changed what acting was, because Brando and Dean couldn't have done this role. Because what's so great about Clift is that he can play meek and pathetic, even at his mumbliest and like hunched up into his shoulders like he's fucking Igor. James Dean is always cool. Like he can never not be cool, even if he's tortured and he's cool. Marlon Brando always has to be the biggest dick in the room. He cannot be nothing but the baddest dude around, even if he's mumbling his fucking lines. Monty Clift, last year we did Red River. Nothing like this performance. In that movie, he's, honestly, in my opinion, he's more badass than John Wayne, because he's the kind of real kind of badass where he's like, listen, I know I can kill you with my gun. I know I'm that good. But I'm not going to be a fucking guy like, hey, you want to get into a gunfight? Let's talk about this. Come on. All right, you want to fight? Fine, I'll fucking shoot you, but I don't want to do this. And then in this, you see him, he's so fucking meek, but then on the boat, he's such a scary little fucking creep. The first date with Shelley Winters, he's a predatory little weirdo. It's just, listen, Shelley Winters is good, and she's your MVP of the movie, Mike, but Monty is so fucking good in this goddamn movie.
Oh, I'm with you, and I do think that the best thing that he does in the film, in the book, there's a whole thing for so many chapters where, when the defense is trying to get Clyde/George off on it, they decide the best way to do it is to make the argument that he was not malicious and that he is not a killer. Rather, he is a moral coward. And they keep using the phrase, he's a moral coward. That's what it is, right? And Clyde starts to take offense to that, but they're like, that's our only defense, is like, oh, no, you didn't plan to murder this girl. You're just so inept and you're so timid. They never have to do that in the movie because Montgomery Clift, in his performance, is just telling you, this is a moral coward. Like, that's it. He's just now, you mentioned, Tom, we have to acknowledge, before we wrap up, there's one other person in this movie we have to acknowledge. We have to talk about Perry fucking Mason puts him in jail. Raymond Burr.
He got the role as Perry Mason because of the movie.
Yes, and we talked about the war having its presence in this movie. The fact that he's wearing war medals, he's walking with a limp, all of this stuff. Like, just, he's in this movie very briefly, but he's so good when he's in it, The way he smacks the oar down, hell yeah. What a moment.
Well, that the fact that it's Perry Mason that puts him in jail, that means there was only one guy who could have helped keep him out of jail, and that's Charles Lawton from Witness for the Prosecution.
So,
love that fat bastard.
On that note, did anybody else have anything they wanted to add before we wrapped up talking the Oscars like we usually do?
Well, I just do want to mention that some of the aspects of Elizabeth Taylor and Montgomery Clift's real life relationship was put into the film purposefully. by George Stevens. They originally didn't know each other. And he was very skeptical because he was already this like method actor type, and she was a pretty girl who was a child star. This was her first mature role. So he was not very interested in like getting to know her. He thought she was just some actress, and they became extremely close. And she became a very maternal figure to him because whether he was bisexual or gay, he didn't have interest in her. And she was very, very comfortable with that. She loved that because every man, straight man, was trying to get with her. And so she could have this very vulnerable and tender relationship with Montgomery Clift because he wasn't. And Montgomery Clift had in real life mommy issues, just like Elizabeth Taylor did. And so the tell mama all part, I don't know if that's verbatim from the novel, but it wasn't in the original script. George Stevens gave that to them like the day of shooting or near that. And Elizabeth Taylor's first reaction was, "What the hell is this? I'm not going to say I'm his mama. I am 18 years old or whatever. Like, I'm not going to call myself his mother. That's not sexy." But it was because of the real vulnerability in their real life relationship that George Stevens wanted to show. And I think that's part of the reason why they have such good chemistry in this movie, is because you see such vulnerability from both of them that it certainly came from off screen, but is also something that you didn't often see in that day. For exactly what Tom said, guys in films weren't often pathetic or, like wimpy or pitiful, or if they weren't the male lead. They were,
They were Peter Lorre.
they were Peter Lorre. Yes, exactly. So to have your male lead and someone as beautiful as Montgomery Clift, kind of that rugged face, still not like buff, believably beautiful, probably, you know, be so vulnerable with her, um, was kind of revolutionary for the time, and I think helped make the story believable and sympathetic. But that's something that really came from real life between the two of them, and they shared that relationship until Cliff died.
So, Tom, as we normally do, as we wind down, how do you think A Place in the Sun did at the Academy Awards that year?
I'm gonna say nominated for 5, won nothing.
Okay, what 5 do you think it is, Tom?
Picture, director, actor, supporting actress, and script.
Okay, so I will let you know it was nominated for Best Picture. It did not win. It was nominated alongside Decision Before Dawn, which is a war movie, Quo Vadis, which is a giant, sword and sandal picture that Elizabeth Taylor actually has an uncredited cameo in. Another Best Picture nominee that year, also in the registry, is A Streetcar Named Desire. So just imagine going to the theater and getting to see Marlon Brando and Vivian Leigh, and then going to see Montgomery Clift and Elizabeth Taylor. And the winner of Best Picture that year, An American in Paris, the lavish Vincente Minnelli, Gene Kelly musical. It was nominated for Best Director, which it won for George Stevens.
Ooh.
Nominated for Best Actor for Montgomery Clift, who lost to Humphrey Bogart for The African Queen. Nominated for
that's tough.
Nominated for Best Actress for Shelley Winters, who lost to Vivian Leigh for A Streetcar Named Desire. You were also correct, Tom. It was nominated for Best, I guess what we would now call Adapted Screenplay, which it won. It was also nominated for Best Scoring of a Dramatic or Comedic Picture, which it won. Best Cinematography Black and White, which it won. Best Costume Design Black and White, which it won. And Best Film Editing, which it won. So it walked away.
All right, so I was halfway there.
It walked away with 6 Academy Awards that night, and apparently George Stevens' son tells the story that they were driving home, the Oscars are in the back seat, the son is looking at him, and George Stevens only said, "That doesn't mean anything. We won't know its quality for 25 years. Of course, we now know it is quality because it was inducted into the Library of Congress's National Film Registry, even if the Library of Congress wanted to shit talk it in its statement. But anyway.
Well, to get back to to kind of round about this whole thing, I think the reason why they it doesn't have like the cachet that it should have for such a great movie is because I feel like a lot of the movies, American movies at the time that last like this and that people talk about and pass down to their kids and whatnot, aren't this fucking bleak.
Yeah.
This is not a happy movie. This is, and I'm sure the not being able to play on television thing played a part as well. But in an era once when home video started coming around, this is not something people are going to the video store around the corner to distract their kids while they work through their divorce.
Well, I also think, to that point, though, I think there's also we talked about this with All About Eve and some other movies where it's like, you also can't, other than the dress, you can't, there's not like quotes from this movie that get pulled out. There's not scenes from this movie that get replicated because you're right. It is bleak and it's also just, it's a hard movie to parody. It's a hard movie to, Looney Tunes were not doing A Place in the Sun riffs,
Oh God.
Yeah, but
I wish.
imagine if
No,
because really, let's talk about this. Like, imagine if somebody. This is a tragic story. It's a dark, sad, tragic story. Imagine somebody tasked with having to riff comedically on such a sad story. Anyway, you're covering the story on your fun comedic podcast, right, Carrie? You guys are in for a treat.
I don't think there's going to be a ton of giggles. I think when we get into the lighthearted aspects, we're usually making fun of any perpetrators of crimes, and I'm sure we're going to make fun of the fact that he came up with such a terrible pseudonym that just to match his monogram suitcase. It's like, well, maybe get another suitcase, Chester.
What
are you doing?
Now I'm just imagining Elmer Fudd being one of the people he comes across after. She fell in the wake.
No, he's the cop that he finds in the woods. Are you Quide Griffiths? You're going to have to come with me. George Eastman. He's in the movie. Are you George Eastman?
Are you George Eastman?
I thought I married her. Anyway, it's Tweety, but
well, she fell into the lake, and she just took a wrong turn in Albuquerque.
With that all being said, Carrie, thank you so much for joining us on the program. Thank you so much for fulfilling a shot that I called back in 2020. I'm glad we made that work.
Absolutely.
I'm so glad we got to do this. Do you have anything you want to plug? Floor is yours for folks on the way out.
Yeah, I mean, if you're into true crime, everything weird, check out our podcast. I host it with my husband, who is also on the Vertigo episode of You're Missing Out, and it's called Ain't It
Vertigo.
Scary? Yes, of course. Ain't It Scary with Sean and Carrie. You can get it wherever you listen to podcasts. Social media is at Ain't It Scary or ain'titscary.com. And thank you so much for having me on the show. It was like being back in school again, talking about film with you guys.
No, we're going to get yelled at by the fans again. They don't like when we talk about college. They're going to come scream at us.
I just had to throw it in there.
Fuck them. If they want to say something, I'll throw down like I'm on the Detroit Pistons in the 2000s. Malice in the Palace 2, baby. Yeah, that one made Kyle happy.
Well, Carrie, thank you so much for joining us. We will have you back on again. We will have Sean back on again. And everybody else, stick around, because we'll be right back with our picks for the National Film Registry.
The National Film Registry isn't some fixed object, frozen in time. It's always growing, adding new titles every year. These annual selections are made by the National Film Preservation Board, with members and representatives from organizations like the Academy, the DGA, and the AFI coming together to debate and decide. But they don't just pull titles out of thin air. They pull from the public, people like you and me, who can submit their nominations for the registry in the form on the Library of Congress's website. What we do, at the end of every episode, is have Mike and Tom pick films not yet in the registry that they feel should be, inspired by that day's topic. At the end of each season, those films will be formally submitted to the National Film Registry for consideration on behalf of You're Missing Out. The only criteria? It must be an American film that's at least 10 years old. Here are today's picks.
So, in thinking about this film, I mean, there's so much to it. I mean, obviously, it's we talked about just how tragic and bleak it is. It is a tragedy, but there's also so many elements of this story and elements of the way this film is made that, so often when it comes to cinema, we always look at what was influenced by it, right? Some of our favorite things are the way that more modern movies draw from classic film. We talked about it when we talked about The Great Train Robbery and how Scorsese lifts the shot of the guy shooting into the camera for Goodfellas, right? But our knowledge of silent cinema is so absent and so minimal, and it gets seen so rarely that the directors of the 50s, the 40s and 50s who we love, we don't necessarily see their influences the same way. So I did some digging, and I was thinking about what films was Stevens modeling what he was doing after, and some of the things that appear in this film, whether it's aquatic climax on the water, with the boat sinking, the way that it tackles this woman being pregnant out of wedlock and the tragedy of this woman out of wedlock, and begging for help, and particularly its use of close-up. The close-ups, as we talked about, are exceptional in A Place in the Sun. And it made me think of this anecdote. I don't know if either of you guys have heard, but in the 1980s, there was a movie called The Whales of August that co-starred Bette Davis and Lillian Gish, the old D.W. Griffith star. And the director said to Lillian Gish, "Lillian, you just gave me a perfect close-up." And Bette Davis wryly said, "She should. The bitch invented them." And that largely has to do with the film that I am picking for the registry. It's a film from 1920, I believe, or 1921. 1920 by D.W. Griffith, called Way Down East. Way Down East is a story of Lillian Gish as a poor girl, see if this sounds familiar, going to her rich cousins for financial assistance. And then a young man who uses women tricks her. He is trying to seduce her, and what he does is he brings her to a fake priest who fake marries them so that they can have a honeymoon, so that he can sleep with her. She gets pregnant from him, and he reveals, actually, it was a fake marriage. That's a bastard child, and I'm hauling ass out of here. She has the baby, and the baby dies, and she moves on with her life and reinvents herself, much like George Eastman does. Reinvents herself only to be brought down by her tragic past. This movie this Griffith film from the early 20s has some of the finest close-ups you'll ever see. Lillian Gish has a moment when she's crying and she realizes the marriage is a sham that feels so much like Shelley Winters' as Somebody's Gotta Help Me. It's absolutely just... There's a climax at the end that involves Lillian Gish being tossed about in a frozen river that's still riveting. Now, Way Down East is not in the registry. So many of Griffith's films are. In part, that's because Way Down East is actually missing some reels. We don't have all the reels. But much like Bread, which is in the registry, Way Down East, incredible film, and really feels like one of these Rosetta Stones for not just what George Stevens would do, but feels like a very influential film for how melodramas get made later. So all that to say, Way Down East absolutely should be in the National Film Registry, so that's my pick. Way Down East.
This one came to me very quickly. A movie about a young upstart who comes from nothing and slowly works his way up the ladder, gaining power wherever he can, using women just to satisfy his primal urges, to satisfy his need to climb the ladder and succeed, to the point where he ends up burying himself with the very tactics that he used, backfiring on him completely. A gorgeous, sumptuous, black and white movie with the balls to just go full out and make your main character totally, completely fucking unlikable. A masterpiece. Folks, I'm talking about Nightmare Alley. A fantastic fucking movie. I love the remake. I love the original. Can't put the remake in. I'd still put the original in above the remake, but that original Nightmare Alley is so fucking good. And Tyrone Power's character is, as much as I love the ambiguity of A Place in the Sun, I do wish A Place in the Sun could have maybe, I don't want to say have more balls, but I'm going to say it, have more balls to kind of make George Eastman more of a pathetic, just weaselly little shit, the way Tyrone Power gets to be in Nightmare Alley. I love Nightmare Alley. I think it's I mean, it didn't do well at the time. But its reputation has really risen in the years since. It's got the remake. It's got a Criterion. I think it needs to be in the. I think it's one of the best like noir-ish movies of the time, and there's nothing like it.
Let's all go to the lobby.
Thank you again to Carrie McCabe for joining us. Next week, Blank Check producer Ben Hosley joins us once again to look at David Holzman's diary. Don't forget to follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you again next time. Here on You're Missing Out.
They honor movies of historical, cultural, or aesthetic importance on the National Film Registry.